Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of February of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates and details, so let's start. And first let's talk about Avdiivka direction. Before we start with Avdiivka direction, of course, I would like to remind you that starting of 19th of February, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, let's say, reset the line of combat contact. Now we see completely different configuration of the front lines, of the areas of responsibilities and so on. And today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Shoigu, visited Putin and he provided him some updates about the situation on the ground. And the most important thing, according to him, that the Russians managed to completely establish control over the chemical plant, to clear the territory, and after that even to move further. So this is the situation about Avdiivka. This information about Avdiivka first was confirmed by the deputy of the DPR somewhere at 6 p.m. of the local time. The deputies of DPR reported that the Russian soldiers managed to clear completely Avdiivka, and also confirmed about the further Russian progress. When talking about Avdiivka, of course, first of all, we need to understand few important things, and I'm talking about let's say about the configuration. According to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians on this direction lost more than 400 soldiers, around 425 soldiers. Significant number of losses, but you need to understand one important thing, that currently there are no clashes, there are no active battles between Avdiivka, let's say, and the Ukrainian positions in Lastochkina, Severna, and Toninka. So you might ask me where the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation get these numbers. I'll explain to you. Currently, the Russians reported that they finished and they completed the clearing operation, and basically the level of losses in 425 soldiers means that during the clearing process, the Russians managed to find additional, let's say, bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. Maybe some of them were buried under the ruins of buildings that were destroyed as a result of FAB strikes. The Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to found significant number of wounded soldiers somewhere in the basements. They found significant number of soldiers in the building that were hiding from the Russian soldiers, trying probably to avoid the capturing or arrest or something like this. And 425 soldiers are the losses of the Ukrainian forces that the Russians managed, let's say, to found in Avdiivka, in chemical plant, in the central part, in the 9th quarter, during the previous 24 hours. Of course, there were clashes between, let's say, Lastochkina and Rabotina fields, but obviously, very unlikely there were such a heavy loss from the Ukrainian side just on this part of the front line. And when talking about that battle between Lastochkina and Avdiivka, today the Ukrainian sources published significant number of videos, and according to those videos, the Russians made few attempts, but currently we can't tell for sure when exactly the Russians were attacking in direction of Lastochkina, and very likely that currently we can see the footage of the attacks that took place on the 16th, 17th, 18th, and maybe 19th of February, when the Russians were trying to close maybe Avdiivka cauldron and not to allow the Ukrainians to leave the cauldron or something like this. So for now, once again, there are no clashes between these two positions. Very likely in the very near future, the Russians will restore offensive operation, will continue movement further, but for now we see what we see. Once again, according to official numbers, according to official data provided by the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Avdiivka is done completely, not just the central part or, let's say, eastern, southern part, including chemical plants. So now the Russians will regroup, of course, and for example, today we also got update that just during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to find around 350 mines, and obviously there are much more. And the most important part that I would like to discuss with you about Avdiivka is that currently and today the Russians published significant number of videos with civilians. I was surprised when the Russians shown us a lot of civilians that survived in Avdiivka, and according to raw calculations, there are around 2,000 people that still live in Avdiivka, that waited when the Russians will establish control over this stronghold. And you know that step by step, small step by small step, the Avdiivka is getting to its normal life. Of course, it's very far to the normal life because the city, the stronghold, was reduced to ruins, but all these peoples that start walking from one building to another, trying to find out whether they're alive or not, whether they managed to survive or not, and they see that most of them survived, and they're very happy. They're happy that the Russians, let's say, establish control over the stronghold, and obviously all these things at least make me think that sooner or later people will start return back to the stronghold to Avdiivka. Of course, not in a year, maybe tens of years will be needed for this process, but obviously this is going to happen. And now another important thing, that today the Russians start publishing additional videos of significant number of armored vehicles. For example, on these photos we can see another Bradley that was almost without any damage was captured by the Russians, and probably the Russians redeployed this armored personal carrier to some engineering factories to understand what kind of technologies the Russians can use to improve their own weapon. Now we are moving further to Donetsk, and today, according to information we have, the Ukrainians bombed Avdiivka with HIMARS. And you know, this is very important update because recently, just a few weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the Ukrainians were bombing Avdiivka with multi-launch rocket systems. The Ukrainians were bombing the town Avdiivka with artillery rounds and so on. And today, the second day in a row, the Ukrainians are bombing Avdiivka with HIMARS strikes, which confirms that Ukrainians lost their possibilities to attack the capital of DPR with short-range artillery. Now the only way for them is to attack this area with HIMARS, which is exactly one of the main objectives of the Russian forces when they started that Avdiivka offensive operation, to move Ukrainian artillery forces as far as possible from the capital. Now we are moving to Marinka, theater of war, and today we got a lot of very interesting updates and details. First, let's talk about Georgievka, Maximilianovka direction. The Russians during the previous 24 hours published a significant number of FPV drone strikes, including Lancet strikes. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians managed to destroy another Ukrainian D-30 artillery howitzer that Ukrainians were using to support their forces or in protection and defense in the vicinity of Pobeda or Georgievka. A little bit further to the west, the Russians destroyed another Ukrainian artillery system. So what does it mean? Currently, the Russians trying to suppress the Ukrainian artillery because they launched a very powerful and very probably expensive offensive operation in direction of Konstantinovka. We discussed the battle for Pobeda for a very long time. This is one of the most, this is the vital, let's say, vital village for the Russians on this direction. And during the previous days, during the previous 24 hours, we received a significant number of updates, mainly from some Telegram channels, from mappers, and most of them were showing additional progress of the Russians. And according to them, the Russians first entered the farms on the eastern part. Later, the Russians managed to bypass this area and to establish control over the northern part of the village. So before I start making this video, according to more or less confirmed, more or less reliable resources, the Russians managed to establish control over something like this. During the day, we got just one video from this direction, and let's take a look at this video. This is the video. On this footage, on this scenes, we can see how the Russians were bombing some positions. And according to the author of this video, he told us that that was like failed attempt from the Ukrainian side to counterattack their positions in Pobeda, but the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainians and they were bombing them with artillery and mortar systems. I'm not sure that the author of this video did really understand that what happened there. According to my understanding, there are a completely different picture. If we take a look at this, let's say, scene, we can see the shape of the stronghold along the road. So this line is the main road that goes from Marinka to Konstantinovka through Pobeda. And once again, there is a shape of a stronghold. And basically, as I understand, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian main positions, the Ukrainian main stronghold, with the purpose first to suppress the Ukrainian positions and to prepare the further foothold for further offensive operation. So now let's return back to map. So basically, according to the only video we received from inside of Pobeda, the Russians were bombing this territory. So this is the area of the Ukrainian stronghold. As you can see, there is no stronghold on the map. I will adjust before the next video. So this is the stronghold, and as I understand, the Russians managed to establish control over the northern street, this one, and the Russians managed to establish control over the farms. And basically, the Russians were blocked by this stronghold and by the water barrier. The thing is that there is a river in this area, or at least a short water, very short or small water barrier that goes something like this. And also this water barrier first of all goes through the city, through the village, to be more precise, of Vadiana. So as you can see, the Russians along the 0524 road managed to establish over every single building that located on the Russian side of the river. And then now the Russians are blocked by the stronghold and by the few more streets to the south inside of Pobeda. So this is the current situation. So very likely that reports about the Russian complete control over Pobeda, at least by 8 p.m. of the local time, were just speculations and maybe some wishful thinkings. Currently the Russians still have a lot of job to do, but the only thing that we need to tell in Russian favor is that they completely 100% sure and know where exactly the Ukrainian positions and the Ukrainian reserves are redeployed. And we know for sure that currently the Ukrainians try to keep as close as possible the reserves, and they're keeping them along this or inside of this tree line. There is considered as a trees, brushes, and so on. And the Ukrainians, if they see that the situation is critical, try to redeploy their forces to this tree line, and then they try to counterattack or reinforce their positions or something like this. The Russians see everything, of course, and during the previous 24 hours the Russians were bombing this tree line heavily with flamethrower systems. Very likely the Ukrainians had significant losses. Obviously this upcoming night of the local time is going to be decisive. Very likely that the Russians are able to establish complete control over the village. So let's wait, and if they're able to do this, obviously the Ukrainians first will be forced to step back towards these tree lines. They will try to establish the next defense belt here, and of course it will slow down the Russians for a while. But the most important part of this attack is not to move and to get as close as possible to Konstantinovka. This option is also very suitable for the Russians, because by this attack they will be able to block the Ukrainian positions inside of the last stronghold that located to the north of Novomikhailivka, and then this is going to be probably even a cauldron of Novomikhailivka, or at least operational encirclement. Anyway, when talking about Novomikhailivka itself, during the day we just received significant number of videos with prisoners of war. The Ukrainians started surrendering, and lots of soldiers currently is under the Russian control. So when talking about these two directions, we can draw some, let's say, some arrows showing the global scope of the Russian attack. The main road is along the road from Marinka to Konstantinovka through Pobeda. The second Russian, let's say, direction of movements is through Slavna, Novomikhailivka to Konstantinovka as well. But these are not the only updates from this direction for the previous 24 hours. Probably the most important updates are coming from South Donetsk direction, because with Novomikhailivka we know this is the end of Donetsk direction, and starting from, let's say, Sladkaya Vadiana is the beginning of the South Donetsk. And according to some Russian reliable sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions from Solodky in direction of Vadiana and to establish control over additional tree lines on this direction. So as we can see, according to some, for now, geolocated, unconfirmed information, the Russians managed to improve their positions closer to Vadiana, to the intersection of roads. And currently, according to this information, the distance between the edge Russian positions and the intersection itself is around less than 5 kilometers, so less than 4.5 kilometers. So on this line, we can also draw some lines of some strategic goal of the Russians to move and to cut this 0524 road that connects, let's say, Konstantinovka, Vadiana, and Ugledar. And that was also not the most important update. The most important update we received today from Shevchenkova. To be more precise, from the line between Shevchenkova and Prichistovka, the town that located on the road 0509 to the west of Pavlovka and to the southeast of Velika Novoselka. The Ukrainian sources published the video of Russian attempt to attack these positions. Currently, it's very difficult to understand whether the Russian attack was successful or not, because the video was published by the 58th Motorized Brigade of Armored Forces of Ukraine. So obviously, when watching this video, we will not see any victories or significant results of the Russians. The only thing we can tell for sure that just on this scene we can calculate more than 6 armored vehicles that were heading towards the Ukrainian positions, few tanks, few personal carriers. So it's not just like a small recco in combat. That was a real attack with significant number of armored vehicles that we used to see in Krasnogorovka when during the active phase of storming of Terikon. As you can see, the Ukrainians also were bombing and attacking the Russians, and significant number of armored vehicles were destroyed. Some of them were abandoned before destroyed, some of them were destroyed during the march, during the movement, and so on. And later, at the final stage of the video, we could see the FPV drone bombing of the Russian forces. So basically, the Russians started its movement somewhere in Yegorovka. They moved along this road, entered Shevchenkov, and then they moved to the north, and somewhere in the vicinity of this intersection, the Russian infantry landed, and then the Russians started declaring operation. During that attack, the Russians were bombed by the Ukrainians with artillery and FPV drones. So, and according to Syriac, for example, as a result of that attack, the Russians managed to establish control over this tree line and to improve their positions in direction of Prichistovka. So you might say, but what is the connection between this foothold and the situation in Konstantinovka, Novomikhailivka, and Vodyane? Everything is simple. As I understand, the Russians are moving and to the intersection of roads 0532 and 0509. So this is the main purpose, the main Russian, let's say, objective in this direction. And the thing that the Russians are planning to do is to establish during the next months something like this. And by the time the Russians are able to do this, they should complete the movement and to get as close as possible to Konstantinovka, probably to 0524 road, so to reduce the foothold of the Ukrainians on the south Donetsk direction and the southern Donetsk direction. And if the Russians are able to get this line, obviously they will try to cross Kashlygach River, this is Kashlygach River, to establish, for the purpose to establish control over the foothold to the west of Ugledar, and then to attack the main road that connects Ugledar with Bagayavlenko, with the purpose to cut and to encircle the Ukrainian forces in this stronghold. So to summarize everything, we see the arrows. The main Russian purpose is to cut this line and to split this territory into few parts. The first one, Novomikhailivka line, the second one, Vodyana Stepnoye line, and this is the third line of Ugledar. So to cut this area, first of all, from the mainland, and then to cut this territory into small pieces and to handle with every single piece step by step, one by one. So this the situation in the south Donetsk direction. We see the Russians had some progress, and obviously they will try to develop their progress in the future. Now we are moving to Zaporizhia area, to Robotyne, but when talking about this territory during the previous day, we haven't received a lot of updates. If you watched the previous video that I published in the morning of the local time, we have already discussed that the Russians managed to enter the first streets, the southern streets. The Russians published significant number of videos of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainians. During the clearing process, significant losses from the Ukrainian side. Also, we have updates about first prisoners of war from this direction and so on. But when talking about the global scope of this area, the Russians haven't managed to enter Robotyne. No, it's not. It's wrong to say like that. The Russians during the previous few days entered Robotyne for a few times from the south, from the west, but by, let's say, 8 p.m. of the local time of 20th of February 2024, the Russians haven't managed to establish a stable foothold neither on the western or the southern part. All the time the Ukrainians counterattacked and the Russians were forced to step back. And most of the military experts are saying that currently this is the line of combat contact, that the Russians can't cross and can't establish control, and the Ukrainians still have possibilities to counterattack and to save their positions just because of, let's say, presence of the main supply road that goes something like this. The Russians are very far from this supply road. They can't get this territory. They can't get this area. No, of course, there is some control. The Russians are able to destroy some number and some, let's say, value of vehicles or infantry that goes from the north to the south, but still the Ukrainians have possibilities to do the same during the Russian attacks. So the situation is like 50-50 on this direction. So we can't say whether the Russians are winning or the Ukrainians are winning. And for example, in that video that we watched a few minutes ago, we can see that the Russians are saying that Ukrainians start using abandoning and destroyed armored vehicles on this direction to hide mines, ammo, missiles, weapons below these, let's say, armored vehicles. And they think, and maybe they thought that the Russians would never think that something like this the Ukrainians are doing. So that's why they kept those, let's say, local ammo depots in safe. But the Russians knew everything, and when the battle started, first thing that the Russians made, they destroyed every single local ammo depot on Robotyne direction. Anyway, the battle continues. The battle is very heavy, and for now, according to information we have, there are no changes on the ground. Interesting updates are coming from Krynky direction. Once again, we are going to talk about Putin and Shoigu. Today, Vladimir Putin also presented the situation in Krynky. He asked the personal opinion of the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, of Russian Federation, Shoigu, about the situation on the ground, and both of them confirmed that Krynky was cleared, that village by the name of Krynky was cleared completely by the Russians. Currently, the Russians have there not just temporary positions, but the entire army inside of Krynky, so everything is under control. And according to official statement either of the Minister of Defense and the President of Russian Federation, we will adjust the map and we will change the color of this territory in the red color, because this is a very, let's say, big proof, the words of so important people, that the territory was completely cleared. Of course, we don't have any updates about the islands, and very likely the Ukrainians still have some positions, very small, short groups on this area, but when talking about village itself, the village is under complete Russian control. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue bombardments of the cities and towns along Dnipro River. The Russians deal significant damage to the Ukrainians. According to the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians during the battle for Krynky lost around 2,000 soldiers, significant number of losses. The Ukrainians were forced to keep up to 4 fully blooded, well-equipped marine brigades, 35, 36, 37, 38, and very likely why the Ukrainians took a decision to abandon their positions in Krynky is the critical situation in Avdiivka, Donetsk, South Donetsk directions. So they took a decision, very likely, to redeploy the marine brigades to the areas, probably critical areas or something like this. Now we are moving back. We are moving back to Bakhmut-Artyomovsk direction, because we have significant updates from this territory as well. And the most important updates are coming from the line between Popovo Forest and Ivanovska. The Russians continue their offensive operation further to the south. And today we got the final and really important confirmation of additional Russian progress to the south. First, the Russians, we had some doubts whether the Russians managed to establish control over these 2 forests. And today the Russians first published the video of FPV drone clearing of the territory. They made significant number of attacks towards the Ukrainian positions. The Russians didn't risk. The operation was maybe even too slow, but the Russians managed to save the lives of the personnel. As you can see, they attacked these strongholds, these trenches, with significant number of FPV drones, and after that they launched the ground operation. And on this video we can see the same stronghold that the Russians just attacked with FPV drones, but now we can see also the Russian soldiers and Russian infantry moving through the trenches. And on this video, for example, we can see how the Russian soldiers dropped some grenades to the stronghold with the purpose to destroy, to clear, or to force the Ukrainians to surrender. Anyway, we have complete and full geolocated confirmations that the Russians established control over these forests, and these are Russian soldiers. And now we have the right to adjust the map based on the geolocation and to show this territory under complete Russian control. For now, we're not going to change the color of this forest, but obviously within the next probably week we're going to receive complete confirmation of control over this territory as well. And after that we can say for sure, without any doubts, that the next after these 2 strongholds is Ivanovska itself. Very likely that the Russians have already reached the outskirts of the village from the south, from the east, and now the Russians are about to enter the outskirts of the village from the north. Ivanovska is the next town. The battles are going to take place currently in Ivanovska, Novomikhailivka, Pobeda, and Rabotina, and on Kupinsk direction as well. Probably few places of clashes going to take place there. When talking about the common situation, the Russians published also additional few videos of counter-artillery duels. On this video we can see how Lancet destroyed another Ukrainian counter-artillery radar that Ukrainians were using to detect Russian artillery systems, but something went wrong and that radar was destroyed. A little bit further to the northwest we got another video of how the Ukrainian T-64 tank was attacking the Russian positions from hidden positions, but the tank was discovered by the Russian Lancet and destroyed as a result of a strike. So the situation in this area continues develops in Russian favor, and once again soon we're going to start receiving updates from Ivanovska itself. And the battle for Ivanovska is not going to be very long. We haven't received anything from the southern Kupinsk direction from now on. This is Kupinsk direction. Of course, I understand that maybe for you it's not so, let's say, comfortable to call Liman direction as Kupiansk direction, but according to the Ministry of Defense configuration, there are no more Liman front line, there is a Kupiansk, and from my perspective, I took a decision to split Kupiansk direction on the northern and the southern Kupiansk direction. So this is the southern Kupiansk direction. Maybe it's better to call it Liman, because who cares, or what does it doesn't matter, but maybe not. Okay, when talking about Bilogorovka, the Russians continue storming operation. The reports about the fact that the Russians entered the first streets of the village probably didn't, let's say, correspond with the reality, or the Russians enter and then under the pressure of Ukrainian counterattacks were forced to step back. This is also a possible solution or possible thing, but for now the Russians continue the clearing operation. And the thing is that when talking about Bilogorovka, this is the area of the most massive concentration of TOS and tower systems, all in comparison with the entire line of combat contact starting from Kupiansk till Krynky. The Russians are bombing this territory heavily. I don't know why. Maybe they decided to use this approach on this direction, to use just flamethrower systems, and to see how this can change the game, how this can change the rule if you can use the flamethrower system massively. So let's follow, because this is not the only update, or not only video of flamethrower strikes. On this video we can see additional updates from the southern part of Bilogorovka, so not very pleasant situation for the Ukrainians. And I'll remind you that just yesterday we saw the video of almost the same strikes of TOS flamethrower systems, but to the west of the filtration station. So just TOS flamethrower systems. Very interesting situation, and obviously after such a heavy pressure, the next thing you should do is the ground operation. So let's wait, maybe the next 48 hours we're going to receive some details and updates about the further progress on this direction. Southern Kupiansk direction, no updates, and northern Kupiansk direction, no updates as well. Just regular clashes, activities, and so on, without any changes on the ground. Important updates are coming from Kharkiv direction. The Russians continue bombing and attacking, and the most interesting videos are coming from the area of Liptsy. On this video, for example, we can see probably Iskander strike. I'll remind you that Liptsy is the area that Ukrainians used, or maybe are still using, in the way to attack Belgorod and the borderlands and the territory of Russian Federation. There are significant concentration, as I understand, of air defense systems like Patriot, maybe IRIS-T. Also, there are significant number of Empire multi-launch rocket systems, maybe even HIMARS, and using all these combination of these two type of weapon, air defense plus rocket launch systems, the Ukrainians bomb and attack the civilian and residential areas of Belgorod. Also, if you remember, during the previous days, the Ukrainians managed to shut down Il-76 with the prisoners of war, and now the Russians are trying to hunt and to find all these weapons, and as you can see, maybe more or less they have some results and success. And now we're moving to Kyiv. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and today, according to Asia Times, regime change is coming to Kyiv. Zelensky may soon be forced out on account of the bloody battle lost at Avdiivka. You know that probably there are some rumors, of course, between the intelligence services and the high-ranked people, something like this, top very important people. But if you ask my opinion, I would say that on the 31st of March, Zelensky will lose his legal power due to the complete finishing of his presidential terms, and very likely that nobody is going to touch him until the end of March, because just by the end of March, the Western countries will ask him to move from his position, and somebody who currently take position of who should be the president of Ukraine according to constitution probably will be the president. Maybe Zelensky will try to hold this power for a few months after that situation, but very unlikely he is able to change anything, because, for example, today the Russian authorities reported that if the situation continued developing the same way, the special military operation will be finished by September of 2024. The Russians didn't tell us at which line the special special military operation is going to be finished, but obviously not on the current, maybe somewhere on the border with Poland. And when talking about the border with Poland, the closest allies of the Ukrainians continue blocking the trade and blocking the Ukrainian, let's say, success in economy and finance. Another video from Ukrainian allies of blockade, and currently the Polish blockade not just the main roads, they blocks also the railway. So in this video we can see that this is not just the blockade, but also some, I don't know, very bad things to do with the situation. So I'm not even sure what the Ukrainians are able to do with this, of course, but the situation for the Ukrainians is getting worse and worse, and we see that currently when the Ukrainians are at the final, probably in the worst situation ever since the beginning of the special military operation, we see that the closest allies are doing with Ukrainians things that completely much worse than maybe even the Russians do with Ukraine. Let's say when I'm talking about bombings and all these things. So we'll see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your like, join on Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.